Hey guys, so I've recently started considering the possibility of doing a modification to my stock JT Fender flares. Just looking at the options, I really didn't care for the look of the aftermarket ones available. There appears to be sort of a back order situation for the Rubicon high clearance fenders. So sort of dug into research trying to figure out how to modify my existing flares to sort of meet the need for the extra clearance I have running 37-inch 12.5 tires. So I was able to find some pretty good references on the Jeep Gladiator forums for the rear. It looks like even the Rubicon guys modify the rear fenders pretty frequently, and so there were some, not necessarily tutorials, but there was information. But I found absolutely nothing on a fender chop that didn't involve an aftermarket bracket and light kit, which is pretty spendy, like, I don't know, $300 or $400 from what I could see, just because you weren't retaining the electronics from the stock. And then I sort of wasn't sure whether or not I want to start that. So after sort of exhaustively searching YouTube and not really finding anything, I just decided to just sort of pull the fenders off, start chopping, and hope for the best. So I didn't even record the actions that I took to modify. However, I do sort of go through in tutorial style format to basically show what I did. Now, you know, full disclosure, and I say this a couple times in the video, but this is the first time I've ever done something like this. So you'll probably know 10 different ways to do this better. However, this is what I did. I'm happy with the outcome, and you know, if nothing else, this will be a resource for someone that's in the position as me that wasn't able to find anything. So enjoy the content and send me a message if you have any questions. Happy to help.
All right, guys, just going through a quick tutorial of what I did to trim the factory Sport. These are Max stoves, so they've got the lip on the outside, fender flares to get some additional clearance, while also maintaining the inner fender liners as well. I'll show some before and after, but essentially got a little over 2 inches of additional fender clearance by taking this method. So first steps before I get started, essentially just cut the plastic rivets that connect the inner fender to the outer edge of the flare. On the first front, I ended up pulling the whole thing off and then doing it on the floor, but I think I'm gonna get more leverage to cut with it still connected to the Jeep. So I'll check back in once I start cutting. All right, so as far as tools of choice, I had 2 options here. So I honestly think that the easiest and best route is to use a jigsaw with a fine blade. It seems to cut the fenders really well, give you a straight edge. Unfortunately, with the lip that's on the Max toe, I really can't get a flat surface to move my jigsaw, so I ended up using a hot knife. It's warming up right now and I'll start cutting. Basically use painter's tape to throw the edge down. I essentially put the edge right here on the outer lip, just sort of to match the body line, and then I'll clean everything up. All right, so the initial cuts are made. This is probably the worst one yet as far as following my painter's edge, so I'm gonna have to clean it up with a razor blade. All right, so the next step I did was remove the inner fender liners by removing the 3 10mm bolts that hold the inner fender liner in place, as well as the several plastic rivets that hold them in place underneath the wheel well. So because my rough cut was pretty bad, I'm gonna go ahead and block sand this with a wet sandpaper to sort of clean up some of the edges before I start trimming the inner fender to fit. All right, so for this next set of cuts, what I'm doing here, what I'm attempting to do, is to utilize these bolsters that support the lower fender structure in order to sort of help them to continue to support the overall fender to prevent sag. So what I'm doing is I'm basically going to modify these things to create a platform, or sort of a mounting surface that I can use these plastic grommets to sort of attach these stock inner fender to. So my first set of cuts is just basically going to be to set the level. So I'm only going to cut on the sides. I'm not going to cut the back at this time. So I'm going to cut here and here. And I'm ultimately going to trim these with a razor blade to get the correct height. So here goes. So I tried a bunch of stuff to make this cut here. I think what I found easiest is to use one of these oscillating tools. I use the hot knife for this. This plastic seems to be a bit harder, but also wants to break rather than sort of melt. So the oscillating tool basically gives me a nice rough cut, and then I'll go back with a razor knife and kind of smooth out the edges. All right, so the first step is done. I've essentially cut that, and it is free with the exception of this back side here. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove this tape. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to cut out this bottom bit here that takes the rivet now. It's too much extra material, so I'm gonna cut that out. All right, so here's what it looks like right now. Basically cut the top out, got some rough edges from sort of melting. Again, that plastic really doesn't like to behave. Still have not cut the back side here. And ultimately what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sort of remove enough material here to lay this down using some heat to where it creates sort of a flat edge there. All right, so full warning, everything that happens after this point I can't take responsibility for. This is an arts and crafts project. I'm not really interested in opinions on whether or not I'm junking this fender or not. So essentially what I've done is I've basically cut this outer support essentially enough to give me what I believe is about a 1/4 inch and should give me enough to sort of tuck away my inner fender liner behind this outer edge here. I did sort of cut the corners out because it makes it easier to fold, gives me a more uniform sort of look. On the first fender, I did sort of make a relief cut right here to help with the bend. I don't think that's really necessary, so I'm gonna give it a shot just using heat and see what happens. So the next thing I'm gonna do is use a heat gun, heat this up and fold this over to make like a flat edge. There's where we are. I would note that on the first fender, I sort of had to cut this one a couple times because it stuck out a little bit too far, and that may be the case again here. So once I got the first one finished up on the last fender, I went back and was able to trim it. So let's see how it goes. All right, so here's what I'm left with. I'm not quite there yet, but essentially I folded that down. Looks like I was right. The relief cut's not entirely necessary now. I did trim a little bit more out on those corners because I said it made it easier to fold. It doesn't make for the cleanest look. And ultimately, a complete novice here. So I considered either getting a plastic welder or trying to use my hot knife to heat up and sort of weld these edges. But essentially what I'm gonna do next to keep this in place, so it is folded nicely, but I want something to prevent it from sagging over time. So I'm basically just gonna drill a hole on the outer edge in here, and I'm gonna use zip ties basically to keep this folded in place. Again, none of this is gonna be visible. And for me, this is essentially a temporary fender fix until I can justify spending a bunch of money on the Rubicon fender kit, or at such time where it's not on a 3-month back order. And so next thing you'll see is this drilled out and zip tied into place. All right, so now I've drilled my holes, basically get these zip ties through here, fold it back down, feed it through, and then pull that down into place. All right, so now that I've got this zip tied, you can see it sort of sits below the outer edge. I don't remember if I trimmed this tab or not. I'm just gonna see where the fender liner falls before I make that decision. So the only real precise thing of this job is I am going to use some flush cutters to cut my zip ties nice and flush. All right, so now that we have sort of created this little platform, for lack of better terminology, I'm going to now modify these additional bolsters to essentially fit that flatter profile, which is going to give me the capability sort of use this as a method of securing the inner fender liner to the fender to keep it from hanging out past that. So phase complete. I've essentially got all of these little bolsters sort of leveled with the new mounting surface. On to the next one. All right, here's the opposite side, just kind of a view from the back. You can see that those outer fender supports kind of make the line where I'm going to attempt to set the depth of the fender liner. So when I start to set the fender liner, what I did was I started up front closest to the light assembly and just sort of worked my way back. A couple things that I did notice is where those 10 mil bolts make up into the fender assembly here and here, as well as right here. I sort of had to make adjustments, make additional holes in the liner in order to get those to line up, because I'm pretty sure it's just from the heat that I apply to the fender liner. It sort of shrinks it up a bit, so you don't end up using this full bracket. I'm going to end up trimming that sort of to fit based on need. So what I ended up doing on the first one, and I'm hoping to repeat on the second one, is basically I want to get everything secured as far as the fender liner, probably about up to here, and then everything from here on out is essentially done on the vehicle. So there'll be some additional trimming after I set this thing in place. And then, so as you notice, this is, thin wall, not really anything to drill into or to use pop rivets for. So what I ended up doing to secure the liner here is I used these tabs for the outer fender, drilled holes through them, and ended up securing the inner fender here to keep it inside. And I will trim these as well, just so that they don't hang out. So next step is going to be to start setting the inner fender. All right, so the hardest transition that you really have to manage, so I've started to connect the inner fender here. This is just sort of a passive pin. Is essentially, there's this really strong transition because of where the marker lights are, that you sort of have to really work to conform this inner fender. If you don't set this line correctly, you'll essentially have sag sort of throughout. You can sort of start to see how I'm going to connect this down. So the way I managed it on the first one, and I'll actually walk over and show you the completed fender assembly, is there's a plastic Torx bit in here that holds a light assembly in place. It is a T30. Yeah, T30. So what I did was essentially I removed this outer Torx bit. I made a hole here, and I'm going to use that to sort of suck this up to conform to the fender. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. All right, so this is sort of we'll call it the semi-finished product. I've still got to sort of wet and block sand the edges here, but I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. But I just want to show you that transition. So like I mentioned, you've got kind of this hard line here. I didn't really want to mess with the structural rigidity of the fender by going too close to that light assembly. And, maybe I will later on, but I haven't noticed any rub issues up front. It's all seemed to be sort of center and back here. So if you notice that T30, I use that to sort of set that line. And then after that, and I think I'm gonna have a much better transition with this one, with the second fender. This was sort of the first attempt right here. So if you notice, I was able to use these rivets moving forward. Now that's kind of a peek behind the curtain, right? But if you look at it from out here, the only real exterior feature you see different is going to be a single pop rivet there, which honestly didn't actually serve a purpose. Ultimately, I would need a longer rivet in order to use it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be focusing on sort of managing the transition on that by using that T30 bit. All right. So the other lesson I learned is you've got these little sort of upsets here where the little plastic rivets sit. These don't serve a functional purpose. In actuality, unfortunately, I cut the first one out on the first fender, thinking that was a required action, but I learned that if I apply some heat, essentially this will sort of conform to the rest of the surface and shrink up and give me a more uniform sort of finish. So I'm gonna basically heat this up until this is one flat surface here, and it cleans things up a bit for the install. So I'm gonna do that before I go ahead and make up that T30 bit. Okay, so to catch you guys up, I essentially made a couple of holes to be able to place rivets, or I don't know what you call these, plugs, to keep this nice and secured against the light assembly. And I've already made up the first 10 mil bolt, and then through heat have sort of flattened out each of these that made up against the bolsters that we modified. So the two bolts that go directly to the frame or the carriers for that fender, you know, in the first one, and hopefully not for this one, I didn't really have to modify the mounting points for any of these, but you'll notice that just from sort of shrinking this plastic, I'm probably off by, I don't know, ½ inch or so here. So I'll end up having to make a new hole probably around here. And what I did for the first one is I essentially did that last. So after I got everything mounted up, inclusive of the frame mounting bolts, I then, you know, I made sort of a guide hole before I mounted the fender up with the body pins. So what I'm gonna do now is just sort of follow this line. You can tell that I already have got a much nicer line on this second fender than I did on the first one. So essentially, I'm gonna go ahead and sort of see where I told you that we had to make that transition. I'm gonna start to pin this down, trim things up, and I'm gonna use these as my next mounting points to kind of guide that inner fender liner. So this is that T30 that I told you about. So I'm gonna sort of start to mold this in. Again, primary tools for this are gonna be, so first of all, sort of a soft surface that you don't damage the exterior structure of the fender. A heat gun, I think it was like 20 bucks at Walmart. Obviously a drill where I'm drilling all these different holes. You're gonna use a some sort of blade. I'm using some of these trim pullers just to kind of manipulate the plastic a bit, and then flush cutters as needed. And it was a real big help for cutting those bolsters with that oscillating tool that was sort of made for multi-purpose, inclusive of plastic. So I'll keep forming that to try to make that body line. So I'll give you an update here shortly. All right, so here's sort of the first point at which we're using these little modified supports to connect the, see, all I did was basically drill a hole in the fender liner, and I'm gonna pin that down. The reason why I left these tabs is I sort of like that I can use a little heat and kind of pin this thing down with that. It's got a little bite to it. So give you an example, just bought a, yeah, that's a reused one. Here's a fresh one here. And I'm just going to sort of work this into that. There you go. So you can, it's still got some work to do there. Move a little heat, but overall things are shaping up pretty good.
All right. So in my defense, what you're about to see is exactly what I told you were going to get. Amateur content. due to inexperience, so learn from my mistakes. So with all that said, let's go have a look. All right, so this is actually significantly worse than what the first Fender looked like, probably because I have been working on staying hydrated most of the afternoon. But essentially in those little bolster brackets that I created, I got a little overconfident here. I think the relief cut between the protection for the marker light housing and the rest of the fender is probably pretty important. So my initial attempt, I basically made a relief cut here, and it kind of back folded and allowed me to line everything up a bit better. Or overconfidence and a little bit more heat gun usage sort of put me on a path that put me in a position where the inner fender was a little bit more visible from outside than I liked. So I ended up putting a bunch more. I don't know how long this is gonna last, but we'll just keep pressing on. So I think at this point, basically is when I'll go to the vehicle and put it on. So basically I've got, you can't see it, but I've got a fairly decent line here, and where you're not gonna be able to see the inner fender sort of hanging out. And at this point, I'll start using, what I did before is I'm using these tabs to basically secure the inner fender using zip ties. So it's just kind of it's an art more than a science here. At this point, there's no more real places to grab. And then I'll just sort of try to, once I put it on the vehicle, I'll push to try to get this aligned as closely as possible before putting up those bolts. So next time you'll see this, it'll be on the Jeep. All right, so life got busy. I missed a couple steps. Overall, I think I still showed everything, apart from earlier in the video, I said that I would finish everything from essentially the middle of the fender, fastening it to the inner fender, all the way back on the vehicle. I don't think that's necessarily the best idea. I was able to get the fender in a complete assembly with the inner lined up, and here's what it looks like. So overall, everything is secured. It's in a single assembly now. I'm gonna go ahead and mount it up. As you can see, I did have to make alternative holes for the fasteners to connect it to the frame. Not for the main connections, those are good, but sort of as you trim and heat, it just kind of shrinks up and loses alignment there. So let's go ahead and get it on the vehicle. All right, so here's I will call it the semi-finished product. So I've got the stock fender liners in place. Chop's been done. You can tell that I've taken, I don't know, between the underside, the flange where the flare meets the inner fender with the rivets, probably a little over 2 inches overall. I haven't had issues with the front rubbing. It's been primarily back here in the center. So I don't really think that light assembly is going to get in the way much, but to be determined there. It's not as pretty when you get inside, right? There's some, some additional pop rivets, but overall, there's the front. I've not done the inner fenders yet for the rear, but the chop is done. I think that's going to be a fairly easy upgrade. There it is.